Thank you for joining us as we discuss today Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. My name is Erica. I work at the Spaldings branch. I'm joined by three of my other colleagues. If you could please introduce yourselves.
Good afternoon. My name is Misty Tronell. I'm the librarian for the Sojourner Truth Room at the Oxon Hill branch.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamel McBride. I'm the Library Associate in Adult Services at the Oxon Hill branch.
And I'm Kofi Martin from the Sojourner Truth Room, Oxon Hill.
Seems to be I'm the odd man out. I need to go to Oxon Hill. So today we will be discussing anti-racism and the Black experience in America, and we're going to center that discussion on Ta-Nehisi Coates' 2015 book, Between the World and Me. So to get started, I would like for us to just start by discussing what is the overall feeling the book left you with as you read it and after you had finished?
Well, I think for myself, when I first picked up the book, I was looking forward to it because I wanted to find out more about the author's perspective on racism. To me, when he penned the book towards his son, it made it seem like he was just writing a letter to his son. But as I continued to read the book and I saw things like Howard University, him talking about PG County, that made me a little bit more interested in the book. After I finished reading the book, I still was looking for more. To me, it was not a chronological story, so the story was moving from place to place and moving from time period to time period. He did, talk about his parents and the influence they had on him, but I wish I was looking for more, like a second book or something more in depth.
Mm-hmm.
You can go ahead, Kofi.
Some of the things, I've lived in the Washington area, went to school both in Washington and in Baltimore, and I've lived in Prince George's County for a long time. So the areas he reflects on and the time period are times that what he talks about, I'm aware of and know of. And so it was almost like reliving the experiences he had and some of his own expectation and how the system was failing him and that he was passing it on to his son. And this is my sense of the unfinished work of the civil rights movement as a whole.
Okay. For me, this time around, I did not read the book completely. I read the book a few years ago when it was first released. And this time around, I had a different feeling when starting to reread the book. I actually couldn't get past the first few pages. I felt a sense of anguish when trying to reread this time because, for instance, a few paragraphs or pages in, he talked about incidents of police brutality, and he, basically did a roll call of people who've been victims of police brutality and racism. And since then, we could add on, 5 to 10 more names that we just know of from the media. And at that point, I found it difficult to go any further rereading the book. So first time around, it was interesting. I found it enlightening and very useful for someone of his son's age, explaining the similarities between now and when he was growing up and what he can, to give him advice on how to navigate things. But this time around, with things being a similar experience 5 years later, yeah, it was difficult to go past the first few pages this time.
What do you think made it? What do you think made it more difficult this time as opposed to the first time that you read it?
This time, again, when he, recalled all the names of victims, and I just thought about all the things that have happened since then.
Mm-hmm.
That made it difficult, and just learning some historical facts since that time. For instance, there was a passage in there, and he talked about some of the things he learned as a student at Howard and all the times he'd spent at the university archives at Howard, and learned about Black nationalism and African history. And early on in those first few paragraphs, I think he referred to some of that history as nationalist, did he say mysticism or something to that effect?
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of struck a chord with me as well, at hearing him refer to that time, refer to history, our history, as mysticism. I kind of that struck a chord with me as well. Just because personally I find some of that information to be healing in a sense, considering what we experience here in this country. So those two things, I kind of didn't want to go any further, and I was like, once we do the discussion today, I'll have to rely on prompts from the discussion to recall other things in the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say I totally understand what you're saying, in kind of like not like the trepidation and the discomfort that comes with reading this book or rereading it or even reading it for the first time. I had originally bought the book when it was released in 2015, but it's taken me this long to read it. And it's a relatively short read, but when you start reading it, or if you just realize what the subject matter is, it can be very kind of disheartening to want to pick it up. You can be disheartened, rather. It can fill you, like you said, with anguish. I'd even like to read the introduction that he lists by Richard Wright, because I feel like it really sets the mood for the rest of the book. And it goes, "And one morning while in the woods, I stumbled suddenly upon the thing, stumbled upon it in a grassy clearing guarded by scaly oaks and elms, and the sooty details of the scene rose, thrusting themselves between the world and me." So that's an excerpt from a Richard Wright poem, I believe, that obviously is where he got the title from. But even that as an introduction to the book, it's very, it kind of paints the scene of this like monstrous thing to come, and it gives you this sense of foreboding, and it kind of like just gives you kind of like a terrible feeling, I think, before he even starts detailing, what he wants his son to know.
I also felt the same sense of anguish, and I don't know if anybody has read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And when I read it too, that was the same sense of anguish I felt, even in that. So the time frames are of different eras, but you can feel the same sense of frustration and anguish the time of Malcolm X and even in the Ta-Nehisi Coates' time.
Yeah, especially if you are you focused on Malcolm X when he was younger, before he went to jail?
Yeah.
Yeah. You definitely can see the horror, the frustration in the Black community, especially with, criminalization, police brutality. You see a lot of that in Malcolm X's life, prostitution. I'm not saying that's not that particular information is not in this book, but it's the conflict that you see in the Black community, where he was talking about as he was growing up, he was afraid. He wanted to tell the son about the experiences that he had, so he can be prepared to move forward in life. So I do see what you're saying.
Yeah, like a sense of hopelessness, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the author mentions this idea of the dream throughout the book. He first describes it in a kind of peculiar way. He describes it as tree houses and Cub Scouts, and it smells like peppermint, but tastes like strawberry shortcake. So what does the dream mean to you, if anything?
Well, I guess when I first hear about the dream, I think about Dr. King's dream, his speech here in this area. Unfortunately, before he died, he did mention how his dream ultimately became a nightmare. So I don't know if the author means by his dream, the dream that Dr. King was talking about, or if he means something with like W.B. Du Bois and the Talented Tenth and Black people becoming successful. I wasn't too sure exactly where he was pinpointing his dream towards.
For me, I think when he talked about the dream, I think it was a sense of different levels of the dream. And so when he talks about tree houses and stuff, but also if you notice, he mentions those that have been achieved and those going to school, and the sense of unavailability of resources compared to the other side of the road, and trying to grasp what others are achieving. And even when you go to a Black college, you will notice significant, subtle differences that all those are shaping the dream. For me, I think he was talking about all those about the dream.
So what are some of the subtle differences that you notice, say, when you go to an HBCU versus a primarily white institution?
Anybody who's lived on a campus, depending where you're coming from and your background, financial background, you will notice that we, even on a predominantly African-American campus, we still have the haves and the have-nots. And what they are able to flaunt, and the freedom they have in dissipating resources while you are wrestling to maximize the little resources you have, because if you finish it, nobody is at home willing to send you extra. And you may take on even other jobs or chores on campus or around the neighborhood without necessarily making so much. And yet some of the others who have resources wouldn't take any of those jobs, and they have a lot of time on their hand for fun. But yours is study and work, and little time for fun or socializing.
So it sounds like the differences in different classes, basically. You're saying
Yeah,
that they still exist.
The fact that we are the same race doesn't mean there are no classes.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, Misty, what do you think?
Oh, along those lines, the differences between the two types of learning institutions, HBCU versus a predominantly white institution, is the amount of resources that they receive. I attended 2 HBCUs for undergraduate, and graduate degree. And then when I moved here to go to the University of Maryland for library sciences, it was like a different world for me as far as the amount of resources available at the University of Maryland compared to the other institutions I've been to. You know, for me, it was like being at an Ivy League institution, and you know, University of Maryland is a public institution, but I mean, just the amount of buildings on the campus, the size, how modern the resources are for different departments, and inside the layout of the buildings, all of it is just like completely different compared to the resources that HBCUs receive. So that's a difference that you know, he probably can draw parallels to when you refer to you know, the dream and differences in resources that the different communities receive.
Do you feel like going to the University of Maryland, in addition to, well, would you count among those better resources that you experienced at the University of Maryland, would you count like better networking, better resources to get a job after graduation? Did you experience that?
Yeah, the amount of opportunities were different as far as like networking and access to job opportunities afterwards. There were a lot more opportunities available at the University of Maryland. Some, you know, I'm not saying that there weren't those opportunities at HBCUs, but a lot more was available, you know, at the University of Maryland.
I've seen a statistic somewhere that said that, and I believe this is for undergraduate students, but it could have been for graduate students. But it said that HBCU graduates graduate with more debt. So in me asking the question about, you know, job opportunities and stuff, you know, thing that would make your debt go down is if you have a job. So it's interesting that not only are many HBCU students graduating with more debt, they also have fewer opportunities to combat that debt. So it seems like it would be a compounding problem, like one problem would stack on top of the other.
Definitely, yeah.
So
sorry,
go ahead.
No, I was thinking about the dream again after hearing Kofi and Misty speak, especially about HBCUs. My grandfather was a professor at Howard University in dentistry. He's passed away now, but when I think about HBCUs and the access to education, access to resources, going into undergrad myself, I didn't see that there. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to go to a predominantly white school, because I figured that'd be my opportunity to get access to the quote unquote dream. I always wondered, you know, being at the HBCU, how you have the opportunity to be around Black people. You know, the whole culture is focused on Black history. And Misty, you probably can speak to this more than I can, but it's like a melting pot of information, you know, different cultures and stuff, but it also gives you networking, which I didn't necessarily get at a predominantly white school, maybe because there was a conflict at times in my own education dealing with, you know, a predominantly white teachers and professors. But I think most people, probably similar to the author, Ta-Nehisi, believes that Black schools is the Mecca to actually get them to the dream, because they won't have the same opportunity to go to the white schools or to go to the military. So maybe the HBCUs is their only gateway.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think to piggyback off of what you're saying, I feel like despite the resource, I also went to a primarily white institution in New York. And it was a private school, so it had a lot of resources. It was very expensive, unfortunately. But one thing that is a barrier for us in going to those schools as well is that you can face those microaggressions and from teachers, from fellow students. So I think Ta-Nehisi Coates, how he speaks of the Mecca of Howard, or Howard's Mecca, it's a place of welcome for Black people of all kinds, where we can share ideas and be inspired by each other and stuff, and we can we can forego the microaggressions and other discriminations that we might feel on primarily white institution or on the campuses of primarily white institutions. And we can kind of just kind of go forth and learn without that burden on our backs. So, you know, I think that's one appeal of HBCUs for sure. And I say I basically agree with you guys on what the dream means. It's definitely a recurring idea throughout the book. And I think that it is, he sets it up as basically the foundation on which this country was built. It is basically the differences in class. It's a class division. And he kind of basically says that the dream, which is the idea that you are above someone else, you know, people use the imagery white picket fence and, you know, White Houses and, you know, the 2.5 kids or whatever the statistic is for people who live in suburbs. That's part of the dream. And how it's not really, everything else came after the dream. Everything meaning this idea of race even came after the dream, meaning white people concocted this idea of innate or inherent differences within Black people because they needed someone to, you know, ascend on top of. They needed someone to lay the foundation in blood and sacrifice and everything like that so that they could achieve the dream for themselves. So,
so what do you think? Oh, go ahead,
actually, I think in a broad sense of the whole of Maryland, I lived in the on the Eastern Shore in Kent County in the 80s. And I was a member of the NAACP. I even went to the high school there to make noise. Because unfortunately, I'm not saying the military is not a good idea, but the Kent County High School, when you were African American, the only races those days we had there were African Americans and whites. And there's a historical presence of the colonial past where slavery, some of the barns and where the slaves lived are still there on the Eastern Shore. But they tracked, if you were African American, and the career advisors will always advise you, go into the military, go into the military. And the whites, they were tracking them to go to college. And that was disturbing to me viscerally. I went there and I made noise, and even some of the, I took some of the NAACP county executive, we went there, and they wanted me to run for superintendent. In that country, a superintendent was elected. I said, oh, no, I just want to stay back here. But it's been in the systemic, so that the dream, college elevates, college puts people beyond where their forebears were. But if the system is not opening it up or directing you or pushing you into that direction, then the same cycle of poverty and the low class will be passed on to the next generation. That was, and I see a subtle sense of that in Ta-Nehisi Coates' book.
So what do you think about him dropping out of college? The fact that he didn't finish.
At least getting the foundation. Microsoft, he didn't finish college. But at least if you spend a year or two in college and get introduced to philosophy 101, sociology 101, a Psych 101. You see, those social sciences will enhance your mind, and it will sharpen and redirect your perspective that the processes and analytical thinking and critical thinking skills, when you put all of them together, they will help shape what you will be and you can be. Be all you can be. I'm not saying it always has to be college, but the college option should never be denied African American children.
I think that's such a good point that, you know, in this current climate of crushing student debt, I mean, I love school, I love college. Not everyone is the same, and not everyone has the same path to take. But I do think that, and Ta-Nehisi touches on this heavily, just getting those foundations that you're speaking of, Kofi, being exposed to people who are different from you. Ta-Nehisi speaks of how growing up where he did, the environment was kind of like homophobic, and certain slurs they would use, and how he went to college and he saw how he was wrong for, you know, using certain slurs that would be attributed to gay people. And that, you know, just that simple thing broadened his worldview. And seeing all these different kinds of people, Black people specifically, I feel like it showed him basically that we could be anything. So I do think that college is really great for that, even if you don't get a degree. Hopefully you don't go into, you know, crushing astronomical debt that you can't pay off for years and years. But I think it is very good for creating that foundation that you spoke of, for sure. And one thing about this book that's interesting is that, as you said, Kofi, earlier, it speaks on things that are happening, you know, in this county and very close to it. I know that it specifically calls out PG County, that's Prince George's County, and an instance of police brutality that was committed by a Black officer in a majority Black county. What do you guys feel that this says about the county, or does it even say anything about the county? Is it just a national issue?
Yeah, I think it speaks more so to it being a national issue, with how police the communities that they work in more so than, you know, this county. With a Black officer being involved in the committing the police brutality, I think with that issue, I think that's more so of an issue that Black people have when working within different institutions and organizations, having to deal with performing your job and being aware of some discriminatory and racist policies they may have, and not being able to delineate between, you know, me being an individual of this community and also, you know, performing my job. I think that's a difficulty that Black police in particular have when, you know, being a police officer, electing that profession. You know, sometimes when incidents occur, you hear some Black officers speak out about, you know, more so about it being about their job, more so than having to take the opportunity to, you know, look at it as an individual situation, because, you know, they're in imminent danger a lot of times. So you may not have the opportunity to discern what's going on with this individual and, you know, protecting the people and yourself in that situation. So I think it's, with it being the Black officer that he, you know, talked about in that situation, yeah, it's more so of a national issue and something that Black officers have to deal with, you know, by by them being a part of a race that's usually discriminated against more so by the policies of law enforcement, more so than other communities. When I read it, I thought about in W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folks. He talked about Black people having to deal with a double consciousness when encountering Black people, white people in other institutions and outside of their community. I always refer to that when Black police officers are involved in those situations, or when I hear them speak out about different situations that involve police brutality. I think that's a major difficulty for them. So I thought it spoke more to than as it being a national issue, more so than PG County.
So you feel like the tying in W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness, you feel like in this instance, when Prince Jones was killed by the Black police officer, police officer, his double consciousnesses, I don't know if that's a word, but let's go with it. They were, one, being Black, and two, being a police officer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like, it's almost like, can those two identities exist just based off of the parallels you're making? It's like, can those two identities exist together cohesively, or are they at a conflict?
I think they're at conflict more so than, with work, they can probably work together, but without, working on it, I think it's probably always a conflict.
Right.
I think police officers and the community, they both have to build a stronger relationship between the two. I have a friend who's a DC police officer, and he mentions just some of the things that he has to go through with other police officers. And I think the community as a whole and the police have to look at each other in a different way. Not all police officers are bad. There are some good police officers out there. Not everybody in the community is bad. But if you're stereotyping on both sides, it just makes for the relationship harder to come together. Unfortunately, we live in a community. I mean, I grew up in PG County and in Southeast DC, where police are looking for criminals. And if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you can easily be pointed out as one. It could be, physically assaulted, arrested, or pulled over. We have to do on our part. We have to take responsibility for our own actions as well. So that means not putting yourself in that position, not carrying guns, not selling drugs. Putting yourself in a position where you can get a better education. So I think it's responsibility on both sides to heal that relationship. Being a Black police officer, talking to him, he talks about how he has to look at the community in a different way. He has to be compassionate, but also do his job. He can't allow criminals and crime to run rampant, but he also has to build a relationship with the community that he works in, so they can respect and treat him fairly as he would like to be treated, and how he would like to get back to them.
I also think there's a systemic problem with law enforcement nationwide. Compared to Britain, for instance, Britain policemen normally don't use guns. They use the bobby stick. But American police is militarized. And that leaves a lot of anxieties out there. But also the same systemic problem that exists in terms of race relations, some also exist in the police. So that sometimes if you're African-American police and you are what may be called too uppity, you may see yourself ostracized or set up. And so you may end up having to dance to the same music that the general police force is dancing to, whereas internally you are torn between identifying yourself as Black and looking out for Black people, and being part of the esprit de corps. And so that is where I see the problem with law enforcement. My own, I've known people from my country I knew personally who were shot and killed in PG County several years ago.
Oh, wow.
And so those days, and then even Montgomery County, they were. So when I was driving on River Road, and you know, the police will always, a white policeman will always stop you. What I was told, always have your hands on your steering.
Yeah.
Don't make any move until he's approached you and asked for your, and you even asked, may I reach into my pocket and take my driver's license? I learned that a long time ago when I started driving in this country, and I've always adhered to it, because if they shoot you, especially with no one around, no one will bear witness to what actually happened, and they've often set up dead bodies for the fall when the dead bodies were not culpable. So that's my sense of the police identity and relationship in the African American community.
Yeah, I don't want us to ignore the anxiety us as Black people might have, because police presence might be in our community. We might become scared of the fact that they might hurt us or harm us. That is present. But I also think, like he was talking about in his book, how his father beat him because either the police is going to beat him or I'm going to beat you. He was trying to help him, I guess, be courageous in the world that he lived in, because he's going to have a sense of fear if he's living in the Black community and he fears, you know, the crime that's in his community, or the police who might, you know, brutally, you know, attack him. So that anxiety still exists no matter where you live. But I think inside of us, we can do a better job of being more courageous and confronting that. And just like the people that's been protesting against, you know, the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we can start that process by coming forward.
Coming forward in terms of what? In instances of what exactly?
So that not only means marching and protesting against police brutality, but going out and voting, making sure that you know the politicians in your community so you can hold them accountable when they pass different laws and stuff that's actually going against your community. So we have to be educated. So it goes, so like with the civil rights movement, when Dr. King and John Lewis and all of them marched, they didn't just march for the, they didn't just march just for that sake. They were looking to actually change the laws. And so they networked with lawyers, they networked with politicians, with people in the community, with famous people to help build the cause and actually make change.
I think Black people could definitely do more in terms of voting, as could young people. I think the last elections we saw big turnouts for both groups. But there is also an issue of voter suppression. So I think it's a touchy issue. Of course, you know, we could always do better. There's always room for improvement, but I do also want to keep in mind that sometimes when great gains are made, greater things are taken away still. Stacey Abrams actually just released a book within the past couple of weeks, I believe. She was involved in the Georgia gubernatorial race, and it was, you know, widely believed that there were some instances of voter suppression and stuff going on in Georgia that prevented her from getting that.
Winning.
Sorry, Kofi, what?
From winning.
Yeah. And I believe Andrew Gillum at that same time was running for the same seat, you know, the governor's seat in Florida. He's a mess, so it's good that he didn't get it. but he, he got some things to work out. But yeah, I just want to, keep that in mind. And I want to go back to what you were saying, Kofi, and kind of what you were saying, Jamil, too, about this fear that is instilled in us. Kofi, you were saying that you were warned to kind of, you were warned how to interact with police to protect yourself. And Jamil, you mentioned how in the book, Ta-Nehisi Coates speaks of how his father was trying to beat the fear into him so that, like, basically as a means of protection. And I want to speak about the long-term implications of this constant fear that Black Americans live in. There's a book, pardon me, it's called Biased. The name of the author escapes me now, but I think she has a PhD from Stanford or something in psychology. And the book is about inherent bias, inherent racism. Inherent meaning it's a part of your subconscious. So even if you consciously say, oh, I'm not racist, oh, I believe in this and everyone should be fair, inherently deep down you have these biased views. So she speaks about how when there's an instance of racism that results in death, like say police brutality in one part of the country, it's felt by all Black people all over the country and even in other parts of the world. So that can create this collective sense of anxiety and fear. Like you said, Kofi, anxiety and fear interacting with the police. And Jamil, as you mentioned, the author saying anxiety and fear interacting with the police in his hometown, Baltimore, or even with other people within the community. So how I would like to relate that to police interaction is that we know, I will say too that I was taught that to be extra wary around police as a Black person. So I think that special precautions should be taken by police when interacting with the Black community because that fear is present. And what that could mean is, if you look at it from a psychological standpoint, when people are at fear for their lives, they act differently. Mm-hmm. They act differently than if they are just walking down the street eating an ice cream cone, for instance. So, and again, in the book, Ta-Nehisi mentions how the sense of disembodiment that Black Americans feel, the disembodiment meaning that we are separate from our bodies, like our bodies don't belong to us. Again, Kofi, being told to be careful when you interact with police, it implies that your body does not belong to you, that your life could be taken at any point just because, systemic racism that's inherent in the police department. So my very long-winded point that I'm making is that I think that to police Black communities, all police, Black, white, and everything else, I think they should be taught how to interact with people who inherently fear them, because we've been taught by our parents, by the news, by different sources to fear police. And when you inherently fear something, like I said, when you have that constant anxiety surrounding one group of people, you're going to act differently, period. So I think that they should have to undergo training that helps them to interact with people that have that experience.
I agree. In response to that, when the Black male, which is not a new phenomenon, has been disembodied even through the times of slavery, the emancipation, the Reconstruction, Jim Crow days, civil rights movement. One of the struggles of Black male identity is finding affirmation as a human being and as a male. But because of that repressive psychological system, I want to relate it to also how sometimes or often Black males by their disembodiment, also tend out to disembody Black females. And that is a reality that we can't heal one without healing the underlying principles or ideas or ideation of sickness or disease. And so the disembodiment that he uses is a very powerful phrase that needs to be explored further.
How do you think that Black males disembody Black women?
The type of aggression and the oppressive attitudes they even approach, I've seen it several times in the Washington area.
Mm-hmm.
There. And their desire to be fully male and human. And when someone outside has denied him that, often when that happens, when a child is bullied for a while, the child also becomes a bully and bullies other children that he has more power over. And this is the sense of that disembodiment that I'm expressing here.
I think you're touching on an important, a very important aspect of the Black experience, and specifically the Black female experience. I don't know if you all are familiar with Kimberly Crenshaw, but she coined a term like in the late 80s called intersectionality. It's gained popularity now as a buzzword kind of, and it's often misused, but it was meant to detail how certain marginalized groups, say Black people, say women, the more, I guess, marginalized identities that one has, the more discriminated against one is. The discriminations kind of multiply each other and they compound each other. Speaking of of Malcolm X as well, speaking on the Black female experience, I know there's a famous quote by him that the Black woman is the most disrespected woman in the United States, or something to that effect. What would you say would be a good starting point to rectify the issue of how Black women are treated in our community?
That's a good question.
It is. So, take a moment, whatever. I
think it goes back to how we see our bodies. If you think about slavery, Black women and Black women were considered workhorses and breeders, and even today, our minds are not considered as, how can I put this? I think Kobe was mentioning about how white students are pushed towards the sciences, and Black students are pushed in another direction. Even in our culture, we're seeing to be great athletes. We're seeing to be good handy workers. Our mind has not been convinced that our bodies are as important as they should be, because we put our bodies in positions to enhance those things that we deem as important. So our sexuality. So you see music videos with women gyrating on the music videos, and men, Black men, displaying themselves in a demeaning manner. You see it on the media with, most of the crimes you see on TV, you see Black people on the screen. We see ourselves differently, and unfortunately we have to renew our minds. And that goes back to how we see our minds, how we see our bodies, how we see our spirits. So we have to take care of our health. That means looking at the Black woman in a respectful way and treating him as a queen, just as Black women treating her man as a king. And we are growing our kids in a respectable and loving way.
I would say one way to change that is for, I think it's going to take Black people on an individual level, familial level, and expand to the community level for us to get a thorough understanding of who we really are, and that we talk about white supremacy and all of how racism is systemic. Along with that, understanding and learning and understanding that those things were put in place. These are not individual incidents that happen. Honestly, is a plan, and these things are thought out, programmed, and everybody has learned how to carry it out and how to behave in our daily lives. So it's just a cycle that continues. It's a plan put in place to ensure that white supremacy exists, and Black people, we have learned our part subconsciously of how to behave in different situations and on a day-to-day basis. So in order for it to change, I think it's going to take for us Black people individually, as a family, as communities, to find out who we are, understand that these things are not individual incidents that happen. It's in place for a reason. And until we change the way we respond to it, how we deal with ourselves on an individual level, it will continue. So I think we're going to have to take responsibility for it. And to me, that means separate from what white people may be doing. We're going to have to do some things on our own before expecting that it's going to change by working together. We're going to have to fix some things on our own before we can work with others to make it change it completely.
I think that's such a good point. I feel like the white patriarchy that a lot of Black people, like say Black Americans, let's stay within this part of the diaspora, the white patriarchy, meaning white gender norms that hail from Western Europe, are not compatible with Black people. They're not the same gender norms that we had before we were taken from Africa, and I don't think they're really compatible with anyone. I don't think sexism should be compatible with any culture, but I just wanted to say I really agree with that part. I also would say, as you said, it starts with the person, it starts with the family. I think one way to rectify these ills that are within our own community is by speaking out. Pardon me. Speaking out in instances of domestic violence, sexual assault, men speaking out against other men, even when other people are not present, women speaking out against, what they see and not supporting it. I think silence is acceptance. So I think one way is to not condone it by being silent. And I think to also, just start speaking out. And I feel like hopefully over time, the idea will change and it won't be as accepted as it is.
James Cole, I think in his book on the blues, we have a copy in the Truth Room. I think it's in that one, where he talks about the blues in the South on Saturday night, the same space. They will play the blues after plowing the fields and picking cotton and everything, and they come and they break loose. Then Sundays, the same space where they were dressed, and the women will put on their hats and dress. And while during the week she's been a maid, and a grown man is being called boy by the white man. And Sunday when they came, Mr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so. But But in that, I think it's in that text that also he talks about the Madonna complex, which was in the time of slavery, the white masters will elevate their wives to a Madonna, the form of the Madonna. And so when they wanted sexual gratification, they will go after the black females. But it is only when they wanted to have a child, then they will go to there. And then some of these will even go to the black males, and then the black males will be lynched. But the same psychological process and profile has, I'm not saying black people shouldn't marry white people, but for our black elites, athletes, money people, when they make it, they often have the same Madonna complex and will go for a white wife instead of an African-American woman. And I think it's the same process of, as Misty said, being taught, and you have taken it to be part of your whole system, and so that sometimes you don't see anything wrong with it, and you continue with the same processes, and then it's passed on to the next generation, so that all of us as a community have to unlearn a lot of things before we can reach a point where we affirm and celebrate each other.
I agree. I think too, speaking on the Madonna complex, I think that touches on a dichotomy that's explored in like feminism and womanism, which is like, I believe it's called the whore/Madonna complex, which is basically either you're a pure woman worthy of marriage, or you're like a Jezebel and you're, you know, down here. I know that slave masters would engage in sexual assault of Black women back in the time of slavery, and much like racism, they did so, and they excused their behavior by creating the stereotype that Black women were Jezebels. And I do think that, and therefore, you know, that we were oversexed, and, you know, it wasn't possible to sexually assault us because of that idea that we were always ready for it or whatever. So I do think that that idea has perpetuated, and it is seen in the modern day, you know, in modern day sexism as it pertains to Black women. I think in the case of some of these athletes that you mentioned, it's my theory that I think that they have absorbed a lot of conditioning that is, well, I think the media has played a special role in conditioning us with images, TV, the news, magazines, you know, online images. I think that it has been more, I think it has served to condition us more strongly than when it didn't exist, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that some of these stereotypes are seen more strongly now as a result of having decades of basically brainwashing through media.
I agree.
So I definitely see where you're coming from with that. And one of the last things that I'd like to speak about is how oftentimes you'll find that when Black people call out racism, that is, well, I was gonna say when it's done by white people, but any racism, really, we are confronted with the phrase Black on Black crime. So I wanted to discuss what does that mean to you, and do you think that bringing up Black on Black crime, first of all, is it real? Do you think it's a valid response to questioning racism?
No, I don't think it's a valid response to questioning racism, not at all. And in to combat that point that people try to make, it's been pointed out a lot recently in the news that regardless of a person's race, most crimes are committed by people that you live close to. And most of us still live in somewhat segregated communities. So black on black crime is valid for people who live among each other. And the same for white people. White on white crime is committed in those communities because they live among each other. So for that reason, that is not a valid point to against racism when it's pointed out. Not at all.
Yeah, that's what I think the author was mentioning in some of his interviews as well about the book. He talked about how in the black community, black on black crime is because you're being killed by people in your own neighborhood. I think when it comes to racism, and especially in the incidents that we've been having with police brutality, people always harp on the idea, well, black people are killing black people, so why is it that Black Lives Matter when they're being killed by the police, but they don't matter when black people are killing black people? I think it's important to note that we have, unfortunately, people in these communities who are impoverished. They're trying to figure their way out, and they take violence as a means of, getting ahead. And unfortunately, that means they're killing each other. But police are in a position of authority, and they should have the willpower to say no to circumstances when they have the option to either take a life or not. They can use other means to use that authority, especially on people who don't have weapons or people who can't defend themselves. And, like George Floyd and other people, they need to take that into account. And unfortunately, they don't.
Kofi, what do you think of that phrase?
Several years ago, I read something that talked about when the most genial dogs, if you put them in a place where you starve them, you hurt them, soon they start attacking each other as a reflex. The system has not dealt well with, especially our Black youth in urban areas. And most of those things happen in urban areas than in the rural areas. And the system has not been fair to them, has dehumanized them, has crippled them, has pushed them down. And sometimes the only option is to strike out. And usually when you are striking out, it's the person nearest you see. And so the problem is not necessarily because Blacks are trying to kill each other, but a systemic problem of racism and an institutional lack of response to the needs of the community have shaped how the African American communities, whether in East St. Louis or Oklahoma or in Baltimore, in the Southeast Washington, all these places have social problems that if they were rectified, most of these Black on Black crimes will be a thing of the past. And so it has nothing to do with their racist ideas and patterns, but it has to do with a broader issue than what they want to identify as Black and Black crime.
Yeah, I think the Ta-Nehisi Coates kind of touches on that, especially in the beginning too of of the book when he speaks about his experience growing up in Baltimore, like as a teenager, um, and how the pressure of being in that kind of environment, how it exhibits itself in other boys that are like maybe his age or even slightly older, and how they kind of, as you said, kind of attack each other. I've also seen, this is outside of the book, but I have seen also studies that basically compare, I guess, the brain composition of kids that grew up in war zones as well as kids that grew up in these high violence urban areas. And they were found to have comparable neurochemistry. And that neurochemistry was different from kids that grew up in less violent circumstances. So it kind of makes you think that, well, basically what it's saying is like growing up in these high violence urban settings are akin to growing up in a war zone, and they should be thought of as such. I also have actually some statistics from, what is this called, the FBI. I like statistics. Just to paint the picture, going back to the question of, is Black on Black crime, is that a valid question? It shows that when the race of the victim is white, the race of the offender, out of a total of 3,500 cases, 2,854 of those cases, the offender, the murderer, is white. So that's for white victims. There's a similar statistic for Black victims. Out of 2,870 Black victims, 2,570 of the murderers or the offenders are Black. So it shows that the vast majority, as Misty was saying, the vast majority of people committing crimes against each other are people that look like you and people who you live by, because the United States is still very largely segregated in terms of neighborhoods. This has been a very, very, I'll say, important conversation. Even I would say maybe a stressful one because of the subject matter. As we close out, do we have any words of hope or anything that you have seen that has gotten better for us in the past few years?
Well, I would say, I think with this COVID situation going on, the community has had to bond together a little bit more because resources are not always available. So you see institutions, especially in the Black community, like churches and organizations similar to that, giving them time of volunteer their services, giving out food to the community. So I think as long as we continue to build that camaraderie between the community and organizations, similar to the police department, hopefully we can progress forward.
Okay, nice.
I think there's hope, especially when the historical moment has allowed Biden to pick a woman of color as the vice presidential candidate. That gives me hope.
Yeah, I think there is hope. I've seen it more on a micro level. I'm aware of people, as Jamel was saying, with the pandemic taking place. I've seen people in small groups become more relying on each other more for support. And because we're having this time to be slow down, take some time away from the daily grind, people are able to relax a little bit, think more about what they're doing, be more mindful of how they're interacting with each other, try to establish some, more peaceful interactions, more so than what you might be used to on a day-to-day basis. So I think, there is hope. Taking hope is still there, and people are learning to restore themselves in smaller groups now, more so than looking for it from outside.
And I think the recent, unfortunately, George Floyd died to, spring forth this movement, but the recent interest in Black Lives Matter, I feel that it almost feels like a second wave of the civil rights movement. So I feel like that gives me hope, despite the anguish that and the hopelessness that I often feel when I read about stories of police brutality or other instances of violence within the Black community. It has been a great conversation, a great discussion. Thank you for joining us, and I hope we have some great discussions in the future.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Same.